Yugoslavia was never a natural state. It was an idea imposed upon geography, history, and identity in the hope that political necessity might overcome centuries of division. From its inception in 1918, Yugoslavia represented an ambitious attempt to fuse multiple South Slav peoples, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and others, into a single political community. These groups shared linguistic similarities and certain cultural overlaps, yet differed profoundly in religion, historical experience, and political tradition. Yugoslavia's central paradox lay in the fact that its creation was both a response to genuine aspirations for unity and a solution imposed by power politics, particularly Serbian dominance after the First World War. The history of Yugoslavia's rise is therefore not a story of organic nation-building, but of repeated efforts to construct unity through institutions, ideology, and at times coercion. Its survival depended less on shared identity than on the ability of successive regimes to manage internal contradictions. In its first incarnation, the Yugoslav state failed to resolve these tensions and collapsed catastrophically during the Second World War. In its second socialist form, Yugoslavia achieved a remarkable degree of stability under Josip Broz Tito, yet this stability rested on fragile compromises and personal authority rather than durable consensus. The creation of Yugoslavia was inseparable from the collapse of Austria-Hungary and the broader reordering of Europe after the First World War. For centuries, the South Slavs had lived under different imperial systems, Slovenes and Croats within the Habsburg monarchy, Serbs and Montenegrins in independent or semi-independent states shaped by Ottoman decline. The war destroyed the old imperial frameworks without providing a clear alternative, creating both danger and opportunity. For Serbian leaders, Yugoslavia offered a means of securing national unification under the guise of South Slav unity. Serbia emerged from the war on the victorious side, having suffered immense losses but gained international legitimacy and military prestige. This imbalance of power shaped the new state from the outset. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, proclaimed in December 1918, was formally a union of equals, but in practice dominated by Serbian political elites, institutions, and the Karađorđević monarchy. This imbalance quickly became apparent in constitutional debates. Serbian leaders favored a centralized state, believing it essential for stability and security. Croatian and Slovene politicians, drawing on their Habsburg traditions of legalism and regional autonomy, demanded federalism. The 1921 Vidovdan constitution resolved this struggle decisively in favor of centralism, entrenching Serbian dominance and alienating large segments of the population. Rather than forging unity, the new state institutionalized mistrust, ensuring that Yugoslavia began its existence with unresolved national grievances embedded in its political structure. By the late 1920s, parliamentary politics had failed. Political violence, ethnic polarization, and legislative paralysis undermined the legitimacy of the state. In 1928, the assassination of Croatian leader Stjepan Radić in the national parliament symbolized the collapse of democratic coexistence. The following year, King Alexander abolished the constitution, dissolved parliament, and established a royal dictatorship, renaming the country Yugoslavia, in an attempt to suppress national identities altogether. The dictatorship sought to impose unity from above by erasing ethnic distinctions and reorganizing the state into administrative regions deliberately designed to cut across historical and national boundaries. In theory, this was an attempt to create a single Yugoslav nation. In practice, it deepened resentment, particularly among Croats, who viewed the regime as an extension of Serbian hegemony. Political repression drove opposition movements underground and radicalized them, including extremist nationalist groups such as the Ustaše. Yugoslavia in the interwar period survived less through cohesion than inertia. It remained intact, not because it had resolved its internal contradictions, but because no viable alternative yet existed. This fragile equilibrium would be shattered in 1941, when external invasion exposed the state's internal hollowness. The Axis invasion of Yugoslavia in April 1941 led to the rapid and complete collapse of the state. The army disintegrated within days, and the country was partitioned by occupying powers. This military defeat revealed the extent to which Yugoslavia lacked a shared sense of loyalty or purpose. What followed was not merely occupation, but a brutal civil war fought along ideological, national, and religious lines. Competing movements claimed legitimacy: royalist Chetniks, fascist collaborators, nationalist militias, and communist partisans. The independent state of Croatia, established under Ustashi rule, pursued genocidal policies against Serbs, Jews, and Roma, leaving scars that would endure for generations. At the same time, cycles of reprisal and counter-reprisal engulfed the countryside, particularly in Bosnia, where communal coexistence collapsed into mass violence. The war destroyed the legitimacy of the pre-war Yugoslav order. The monarchy, exiled and increasingly irrelevant, was unable to present a credible vision for post-war reconstruction. In contrast, the communist-led partisans, under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, emerged as both the most effective resistance force and the only movement capable of articulating a new political future. The communist victory in 1945 marked not merely a regime change, but the refounding of Yugoslavia on entirely new ideological and institutional foundations. Tito's partisans claimed legitimacy through wartime resistance and revolutionary transformation, allowing them to dismantle the monarchy and establish a socialist federation. Crucially, the new Yugoslavia was organized as a federal state, recognizing 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces. This structure was designed to neutralize nationalism by granting formal equality while subordinating all identities to socialist ideology. The Communist Party presented itself as the ultimate arbiter of unity, capable of transcending ethnic divisions through class solidarity and revolutionary legitimacy. In its early years, Yugoslavia closely aligned with the Soviet Union, adopting centralized economic planning and authoritarian political control. Yet even in this period, Tito demonstrated an unusual degree of independence, resisting full subordination to Moscow. This independence would soon become decisive for Yugoslavia's survival. The break with Stalin in 1948 was a moment of existential crisis for Yugoslavia. Isolated from the Eastern Bloc and threatened with invasion, the regime faced the possibility of collapse. Instead, it adapted. Tito used the split to assert Yugoslavia's sovereignty and develop a distinctive model of socialism based on workers' self-management and non-alignment. This ideological flexibility transformed Yugoslavia's international position. No longer a satellite state, it became a leading voice in the non-aligned movement, balancing relations with both East and West. Western economic aid and political support strengthened the regime, while international prestige reinforced Tito's domestic authority. Internally, the system provided a framework for coexistence. Economic growth, rising living standards, and limited cultural autonomy helped contain nationalist tensions. Tito's personal authority became the linchpin of the system. He was simultaneously revolutionary hero, head of state, and symbolic embodiment of Yugoslav unity. By the 1960s, Yugoslavia faced new challenges. Economic decentralization, intended to improve efficiency and regional development, also empowered Republican elites. National identities, suppressed rather than eliminated, re-emerged in cultural and political forms. The Croatian Spring of the early 1970s demonstrated both the persistence of nationalist sentiment and the regime's limits in accommodating it. The 1974 constitution represented the culmination of Yugoslavia's attempt to institutionalize balance. It granted extensive autonomy to republics and provinces, while weakening the federal center. In the short term, this arrangement preserved stability and reassured smaller national groups. In the long term, it created a system dependent on consensus, without providing mechanisms to enforce it. Tito's death in 1980 marked the end of an era. He left behind a country that appeared stable, prosperous, and internationally respected, yet one whose unity rested on unresolved contradictions. The question was no longer whether Yugoslavia had been successfully built, but whether it could endure without the man who had held it together. By 1980, Yugoslavia stood as one of the most unusual political experiments of the 20th century, a multi-ethnic socialist federation that had survived war, dictatorship, and Cold War pressures. Its rise was neither inevitable nor illusory. It was real, achieved through extraordinary political skill and historical contingency, yet its success was conditional. Yugoslavia functioned not because it had resolved the problem of national identity, but because it had managed it through federalism, ideology, economic growth, and above all, Tito's authority. When Josip Broz Tito died in 1980, Yugoslavia did not collapse. On the surface, the system he had built appeared resilient. The federal structure remained intact, the League of Communists continued to govern, and the country retained international credibility. Yet Tito's death removed the central pillar that had sustained the delicate equilibrium between Yugoslavia's competing national, political, and economic interests. What followed was not an immediate disintegration, but a gradual erosion of authority, legitimacy, and cohesion. The post-Tito period exposed the extent to which Yugoslavia had depended on personal leadership rather than institutional strength. The federal system, designed to balance competing republics, proved ill-equipped to handle sustained crisis. Economic decline, political paralysis, and the resurgence of nationalism combined to destabilize the state. The collapse of Yugoslavia was therefore not inevitable, but it became increasingly likely as these pressures converged. The first major challenge to post-Tito Yugoslavia was economic. During the 1970s, the country had relied heavily on foreign loans to sustain growth and rising living standards. By the early 1980s, this model became unsustainable. Yugoslavia faced mounting external debt, high inflation, and increasing unemployment. Regional disparities, long a feature of the Yugoslav economy, became more politically salient as wealthier republics such as Slovenia and Croatia grew resentful of subsidizing poorer regions, while less developed areas demanded greater federal support. Economic crisis quickly translated into political dysfunction. The collective presidency established after Tito's death rotated leadership among the republics, but lacked the authority to make decisive policy. The federal government found itself unable to implement coherent economic reforms, as Republican leaders prioritized local interests over national solutions. This institutional gridlock undermined confidence in the state and weakened the legitimacy of the ruling communist system. At the same time, the broader ideological context was shifting. Across Eastern Europe, socialist regimes were losing credibility, and Yugoslavia, despite its more liberal system, was not immune. As economic hardship deepened, the promise of socialism as a unifying force lost its appeal. In its place, older forms of identity, particularly nationalism, began to re-emerge as powerful sources of political mobilization. The resurgence of nationalism in Yugoslavia during the 1980s was not simply a spontaneous revival of ancient hatreds, but a politically driven process. Leaders increasingly turned to nationalist rhetoric as a means of consolidating power in a context where communist ideology no longer commanded loyalty. Among these leaders, Slobodan Milosevic played a decisive role. Milosevic rose to prominence within the Serbian Communist Party by positioning himself as a defender of Serbian interests, particularly in relation to the autonomous province of Kosovo. By the late 1980s, tensions in Kosovo, where the majority Albanian population demanded greater autonomy, had become a focal point for Serbian grievances. Milosevic exploited these tensions, framing the issue as one of national victimhood and promising to restore Serbian authority. Through a series of political maneuvers often referred to as the anti-bureaucratic revolution, Milosevic effectively consolidated control over Serbia and its autonomous provinces, Vojvodina and Kosovo, as well as Montenegro. This shift altered the balance of power within the Yugoslav Federation, raising fears among other republics that Serbia was seeking to dominate the state. In Slovenia and Croatia, political elites responded by advocating greater autonomy and increasingly independence. Nationalism thus became a self-reinforcing dynamic. Serbian centralization provoked resistance, which in turn justified further nationalist mobilization. By the end of the 1980s, the fragile consensus that had sustained Yugoslavia was rapidly dissolving. The collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe in 1989-1990 accelerated Yugoslavia's crisis. Multi-party elections were introduced, bringing nationalist parties to power in several republics. The League of Communists, once the central unifying institution, effectively disintegrated. Efforts to reform the federation or negotiate a new constitutional arrangement failed. Slovenia and Croatia, unwilling to remain in a state they perceived as increasingly dominated by Serbia, declared independence in 1991. The Yugoslav People's Army, JNA, nominally a federal institution but increasingly aligned with Serbian leadership, intervened. In Slovenia, the conflict was brief and limited. In Croatia, it escalated into a prolonged and violent war, marked by territorial disputes and ethnic cleansing. The most devastating conflict occurred in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Unlike Slovenia and Croatia, Bosnia had a deeply mixed population of Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. Its declaration of independence in 1992 triggered a multi-sided war in which competing national projects sought to carve out ethnically homogeneous territories. The conflict was characterized by systematic atrocities, including mass killings, forced displacement, and the siege of cities such as Sarajevo. International intervention, initially hesitant and fragmented, eventually played a decisive role in ending the violence. The Dayton Accords of 1995 brought the Bosnian War to a close, but at the cost of entrenching ethnic divisions within a highly complex and fragile political structure. Even as Yugoslavia disintegrated, a reduced state persisted. In 1992, Serbia and Montenegro formed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, often referred to as the Third Yugoslavia. This entity claimed continuity with the original federation, but in reality represented a fundamentally different state, dominated by Serbian leadership and lacking the multinational character of its predecessor. The new Yugoslavia faced severe challenges. International sanctions, imposed in response to its role in the conflicts, crippled the economy and isolated the country diplomatically. Internally, Milosevic maintained power through a combination of nationalist rhetoric, political control, and repression of opposition. The most significant crisis of this period emerged in Kosovo. By the late 1990s, tensions between Serbian authorities and the Albanian population escalated into open conflict. The Kosovo War of 1998-1999 drew international attention and culminated in a NATO intervention against Yugoslavia. The war ended with the withdrawal of Serbian forces and the establishment of international administration in Kosovo, further weakening the Yugoslav state. Milosevic's fall from power in 2000 marked the beginning of the end. Without his leadership, the already tenuous union between Serbia and Montenegro unraveled. In 2006, Montenegro declared independence, formally dissolving what remained of Yugoslavia. The state that had been created in 1918 had, after decades of transformation and contraction, ceased to exist. The collapse of Yugoslavia has generated extensive debate among historians and political analysts. One of the most persistent explanations, that Yugoslavia was doomed by ancient ethnic hatreds, is inadequate. While historical tensions were real, they do not explain why violence erupted when it did, nor why it took the specific forms it did. A more convincing interpretation emphasizes the interaction of structural weaknesses and political agency. Yugoslavia's federal system, particularly after the 1974 constitution, created a delicate balance that functioned in times of stability but faltered in crisis. Economic decline undermined legitimacy, while the absence of strong central authority prevented effective response. Within this context, nationalist leaders were able to mobilize support by redefining political conflict in ethnic terms. External factors also played a role, though not a determining one. The end of the Cold War removed the international framework that had supported Yugoslavia's non-aligned position, while the responses of external powers to the conflicts of the 1990s were often inconsistent and reactive. Ultimately, however, the decisive forces driving Yugoslavia's collapse were internal. The fall of Yugoslavia was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over more than 2 decades. It began with economic crisis and institutional decay, accelerated through political conflict and nationalist mobilization, and culminated in war and fragmentation. The violence of the 1990s was not an inevitable outcome of diversity, but the result of a system that failed to manage that diversity under pressure. Yugoslavia's history offers a broader lesson about the challenges of multinational states. Its rise demonstrated that coexistence was possible, even under difficult conditions. Its fall revealed how quickly that coexistence could unravel when political institutions lose legitimacy and leaders turn to division as a strategy of power. In the end, Yugoslavia was both a success and a failure, a state that, for several decades, managed to bridge profound differences, yet ultimately proved unable to sustain that achievement. Its story is not merely one of collapse, but of the limits of political engineering in the face of deep structural and human realities. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.